Good afternoon, friends, or good afternoon here in Oz. Welcome to our ongoing series in Mark's Gospel. My name's Dave Fuller, life member of the club and the current president of the Melbourne chapter. Last week, and I want to pick up from where Buckshot left off, Jesus is now in Gentile territory. He was up there in Tyre, there by the Mediterranean Sea, and encountered a Syrophoenician woman and ultimately healed her sick child. And as we come into today's passage, Jesus continues in that territory. He moves north up the Mediterranean coast to a place called Sidon, which is probably about 32k north of Tyre. And then he drops sort of in a southeasterly direction, goes down near the Sea of Galilee, just to the north of it, crosses the Jordan, and then goes down into the Decapolis, which is sort of really to the southeast again of the Sea of Galilee. But it's of note that he's still in Gentile territory, and it would appear that he's traveling alone. There's no mention of the disciples, it's just him. And he appears to be operating in a reasonably incognito fashion. However, his fame and reputation had gone before him, and we'll see that picked up in this story today. So let me read the first verse, which really is what I've explained. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. And as he comes into that particular region, the story starts at verse 32. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside away from the crowd, Jesus put his finger in the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said, "Ephphatha," which means be opened. At this the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Well, presumably some friends have brought this man to Jesus. Jesus' reputation has gone before him, and these friends take their friend who can't hear, and as a consequence that often goes with deafness, has a speech impediment as well, in the hope that Jesus might be able to heal him. And just as was common in other healers of the day, Jesus puts his fingers in the man's ears and takes some spit from his mouth to put on his tongue, a very, very common practice of the day. He also takes the man aside privately rather than operating in the open. There's something going on here that's also unique, however. And what is unique here is not only who's doing the healing, but what this healing act points to of itself. The Greek word used to describe his speech impediment here in Mark is used only once in the rest of the Bible. And in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the passage Isaiah 35, 5-6, we find this same Greek word. And this passage in Isaiah 35 is considered a messianic prophecy concerning the promised Messiah and some of the signs that will accompany his ministry. Isaiah writes, "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy." Signs that we see here, and ultimately other signs in the ministry of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels. This sign points to Jesus as Israel's promised Messiah. The other thing we note in this healing encounter that Mark picks up is the sort of deep sigh that comes from Jesus as he shouts out the word in Aramaic, "be opened." The Apostle Paul uses this same word to speak of the Christian's inner struggle in Romans 8 and 1 Corinthians 5. And whether Jesus has healed a Gentile here, which is highly likely, hard to tell because both Jews and Gentiles of the day spoke in Aramaic. Immediately the man is healed and his ears were opened, his tongue released, and he was able to speak plainly. A beautiful story of healing and liberation. It's interesting watching Jesus' response after this miracle. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He makes even the deaf hear and the mute speak. One of the things we do notice in Mark that often in the aftermath of a miracle, whether it's a liberation of someone from a demonic power, whether it's a healing, or whether he's doing a miracle in front of his disciples, he exhorts them not to tell anyone. And many scholars call this the so-called messianic secret, the idea that Jesus purposely hid his identity as the Messiah during his lifetime. In terms of an Aussie phrase, he wasn't out there to big note himself. He was there quietly going about his Father's business. After the healing, the crowd is overwhelmed with amazement at this miracle performed by Jesus. He makes even the deaf to hear and the mute to speak, they proclaim, which is a direct quote from Isaiah 35, verses 5 to 6. Well, friends, how do we reflect upon this very short and simple story? But I do want to suggest there are multiple layers within it as I draw this brief reflection to a conclusion. Jesus' compassion is again on full display, and it would appear it's beautiful compassion towards a Gentile. Jesus is in Gentile territory. There's real history, sadly, between the Jews and the Gentiles. It's a history full of suspicion, low-level hostility, and even racism. And, Jesus has probably put himself at some risk going into that turf by himself as a Jewish teacher. The other thing that's on display, I think, is the care again of friends, or what we might call mates here in Australia. They have heard of Jesus' reputation of healing, and out of concern for their friend who was deaf and mute, they bring him to Jesus in the hope that Jesus will heal him. It's a step of faith by them. It's a step of love. It's a step of concern. The other thing that's I think I see here is something about the nature of Christian mission. Sometimes we will be called to operate in difficult places, places where there is hostility, places where there is suspicion, places where there is sometimes outright opposition. And Jesus is operating in a pretty low level, under the radar sort of way in this particular encounter. It probably reminds us that there are Christians operating in lots of different places in our world today where they're required to operate under the radar, anonymously, potentially almost in secret. I think there's another dimension of Christian mission here that I see, particularly in the context of Australia. Australia was colonised by the British over 200 years ago. But that act of colonisation ultimately was an act of theft and murder to our Indigenous peoples. And the aftermath and long-term impact of those two sins has cast a long shadow into the future of our nation, something that we are still grappling with. And I think another dimension of mission is that sometimes we will be called to go to places where there's hostility toward us for reasons of our acts or what we've actually been associated with. And we, for better or for worse, we're associated with the colonisation of our nation. And so there is a need for reparation. There is a need for healing. There is a need for restitution. And so another aspect of Christian ministry I see coming out of this encounter is that particular act. I want to conclude, however, with an incredibly good news story. Many years ago, I was at a local doctor with my son, and an old man walked into the surgery. And I said to my son, I said, "You know who that guy is?" And he said, "No." And I said, "That's Professor Graham Clark." And my son said to me, "Who's he?" And I said, "Professor Graham Clark is an ear and hearing specialist doctor. And he and a team many years ago here in Melbourne developed what is known as the cochlear ear implant. Took a long time to get that to work properly. Clark, motivated out of his profound, deeply Christian faith and his scientific skills and passion, was able to, with a team of others, to develop the cochlear ear implant that brought liberation and freedom to just countless thousands of people around the world, enabling them to hear for the first time, and then to go through the task of learning to speak properly and clearly and plainly, because they could now actually hear their own speech and the speech of others. So friends, I conclude with that story. I suggest, if you want to, is type in Professor Graham Clark into your search engine, and you'll see some YouTube clips come up of this incredible invention that he put together. But what is most astounding to watch, his friends, is the people and the expressions on the faces of children and adults when they can hear for the first time. The sense of joy and freedom is liberating. It certainly made me cry, and it might do the same to you. Amen. I'll leave it for now, and my friend Barrow will pick up on Mark's Gospel next week. Amen.